Okay, so the first video of the series on Chariots of Consciousness will be involving that of the definition of consciousness, beginning with subjectivity. And so subjectivity is integral to the understanding of such a complex topic and why the phenomena is so unexplainable in scientific circles. It still remains an enigma, essentially, in science. There really is no conclusive answer been provided. There's metaphysical texts, there's philosophical text, and scientific literature. However, still, the description of subjectivity in the first person is yet to really be understood and explained, being that it's almost impossible for it to be an emergent or a biologically evolved phenomena. And so what I mean by subjectivity is, once again, the first person view. So first person view in consciousness would be, of course, the view from inside of your head, inside of your body, and why your situation and your subjective interpretation of reality and the world is unique to you specifically, which is almost an unexplainable ordeal when you think about it. The fact that it's like something to be you, and it's like something to be me, and it's like something to be whoever on the human level is, interestingly enough, proposed and called the hard problem of consciousness. So subjectivity in the first person, being that you actually see the color red or I see the color red, and that elicits a different behavioral and emotional response in both me and somebody else, is something of almost unexplainability, because it doesn't have an evolutionary root and doesn't make any sense as far as evolution by natural selection is concerned, because you would generally be just a philosophical zombie, as they call it, would be the way that it would evolve through evolution. You wouldn't have such a high level of information processing begetting a subjective experience that ties together negative, positive emotional responses that are unique to you, and then the origin of altruism and things like that. So the subjectivity issue is one of great intrigue, and that is essentially the way that David Chalmers, a philosopher, describes this is it like something? Is it like something to be you? And actually, he uses a bat as an analogy, to be a bat. And so that's David Chalmers' title of one of the most famous essays ever publicized on consciousness in the first person. And this is in itself called The Hard Problem. And that's a real name. Wikipedia says so. And as it comes down to it, it's still a very hard problem, so it's aptly named, and it's the crux of what this video series is getting at, is more so the metaphysical idea of the hard problem and coming at it from multiple attack angles, from philosophy to science to religion. And so the hard problem is subjectivity. And essentially, the easy problem is the neurobiological. So the easy problem is neurobiological, meaning which is essentially looking at the correlates, the neural correlates between voluntary action, thought, and emotion, and that of the human brain. And so it's a third-person analysis. This isn't a first person, but a third-person view. So this will be this kind of analysis of consciousness is not merely self-reporting from a person's subjective experience and how they document it and report it in a study. This could be observed in the third person in the laboratory, looking at data and seeing that when I move my left arm, this part of my brain activates, or when I see this kind of image, this part of the amygdala or the hypothalamus becomes activated. So you're looking at, if this happens, then this happens. Essentially like throwing a rock in a well and listening for the echo using an EEG machine is what you're doing, and that helps develop a measurement scale of consciousness, but it does not get at the crux of the hard problem. And so the easy problem is neurobiological, and you're using EEGs and you're using scientific analysis to see the neural correlates. So neural correlates, and what this does, performing studies on the easy problem and trying to figure out these neural correlates is directly linked to a very important and humane and ethical aspect of this, which is developing a measurement scale of consciousness, measuring consciousness. So the investigatory work being done into the easy problem is important because it'll allow us to eventually understand consciousness in all of its states and all of its levels, from anesthesia, sleep, deep sleep, and wakefulness. And so subjectivity is not applicable to the easy problem as far as the self-reporting bias that people may be concerned about occurring whenever you're analyzing consciousness in itself in the first person. The easy problem being a third-person neurobiological look into consciousness, trying to understand how information processing in the brain could possibly even beget a first-person consciousness at a high level. So there's some people that think that as the brain organizes itself so hierarchically over evolutionary time, and it got to the humans, when we have such a large brain now, they believe that as that brain got larger and the central nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system grew to the complexity that they have, it naturally led to a first-person perspective view of the world. And so it's simply an emergent phenomena. So a lot of scientists and rational thinkers do not want to delve into the philosophy of consciousness too much as to avoid the third-person analysis. So as they study this, they believe that either the hard problem will become a non-issue, or they don't care if it's ever answered because it doesn't have really much effect on science, or they may lead to them to a breakthrough study that shows that it is an emergent and an arising phenomena that occurs biologically throughout neural evolution. So the definition of consciousness centers around the hard and the easy problem. Is it like something to be you? And why would that matter? And why would that arise naturally if it's not necessarily beneficial to the species and advancing the species from a standpoint of natural selection? Okay. And to not make the video too long, I don't want to keep these going 30 minutes each. I want to kind of keep it brief. We looked at subjectivity, the first and third person. Is consciousness simply a result of complex neural arrangement via biological mutation and natural selection over time, that we just became subjectively experiential in the first person? So we have emotions, and when we see something, I may interpret the color blue as something, and you may interpret it as another. That makes us unique individuals. Doesn't have an origin in evolution, from the logical side of looking at it. And so the third person scientific analysis of consciousness hopefully will beget something useful in that realm. Now, moving forward, the reason that this is a question worth asking on the hard problem side is because of philosophical zombie argument, which was put forth by a philosopher. And it basically says that philosophical zombie is what we would expect to see if we were looking at things from an evolutionary and biological standpoint. We would expect to see humans exist without a sense of self developing. Basically being able to go through life without having ties that bind ourselves to emotion, virtue, altruism, and martyrdom, and things that are kind of abstract emotional states or abstract wisdom type things. You would have just a human being that would see the color red with light interpreting retinas and know that it's red, but it wouldn't elicit a feeling within you. You wouldn't have this hate or this anger or react in a way that has a direct causation linked to that in the subjective first person. So a philosophical zombie is what we propose to have to exist, a basically non-subjective life that can communicate, but it isn't like something to be that. So essentially, bringing a philosophical zombie, you would expect humans to have a brain and a neural processing center, just like a computer, and you would plug in sensory data and stimuli to it, and we would respond accordingly with three motivations, or two motivations, which would be reproduction, survival, and I would say sustenance, food, water. So we would basically have our five senses would be used only to do these three things. You would never have the origin of a subjective experience based on anything that would prevent these three things from occurring. And so I would encourage you to look more into the philosophical zombie and look at some YouTube videos on it that explain this a little bit better. But essentially, the human brain would be just a computer that operates in favor of these three actions, but it doesn't do that. And so at some point, when we had an arrangement of complex neural components within the brain and neurological circuitry, something arose or manifested within the mind where we have subjective experience, abstract emotional states, things like that, that don't really make sense if you're looking at this from a purely evolutionary standpoint. And an emergent standpoint doesn't really make sense because by definition of emergent in science, consciousness doesn't really meet that criterion to be emergent, nor does it have the ability to be simply physicalist, materialist, panpsychist. And so that was pretty much the crux of that. And with my intent with this first video was, like I said, maybe do some further explanatory looking into things. I'll post some links and videos and articles here and some of my writings I've done on this subject, just so I'm not plagiarizing everybody else, and I can show you some of my personal beliefs and opinions on it. So here we got we got the first versus third person, first versus third, hard versus easy problem, and also the philosophical zombie argument. So these three things here are basically how we get to a definition of sorts of consciousness. Now, coalescing all three of these into a unified definition is like trying to merge, general relativity and quantum mechanics. It's just either A, not going to happen, or B, it's going to be a long ways off, and it's going to piss off a lot of scientists who have already come before it. So that's probably a battle to be had by the academia field, as opposed to amateur YouTubers talking about nonsense. And so then the hard versus easy problem being, is it like something to be you uniquely? And then the neural correlates of action and voluntary movement, those hopefully will work together at some point. And then the philosophical zombie argument really just provides a justification for why the hard problem matters and why it's so critical to continue to pursue the underpinnings of it through philosophical and metaphysical study. And that's basically the crux of what I wanted to get at today. I don't want to go much further. I'm going to further elaborate on these in the next video. I'm just trying to keep these all at about 10 minutes. All right, that'll do it. Thank you guys for listening.